Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. In October 2017, the Friends of Northeast Philadelphia History acquired a collection of correspondence, papers, and other items of the interrelated Gordon, Saltar, and Wharton families of the Magnolia Grove estate in Tacony, which sat on the river between today's Levick Street and McGee Avenue. Dated from 1723 to 1858, the collection contains 396 items consisting of a business ledger, a small notebook, an almanac, bills, receipts, wills, legal documents, indentures, checks, promissory notes, stock certificates, silhouettes, leases, miscellaneous papers, and 102 letters, including some well-known letters written by Francis Fanny Saltar, some information from which was published by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1916 as Fanny Saltar's Reminiscences of Colonial Days in Philadelphia. I had the good fortune to be able to analyze the items in this collection, and it provided a unique opportunity to supplement my previous research into the families of Magnolia Grove for a book I wrote on Tacony history concerning William H. Gatzmer and the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad. Items in this collection connected a considerable amount of dots and filled in an equal amount of blanks. This is the largest known collection of papers from these families. Duke University holds a smaller collection of the Saltar family correspondence, consisting of 200 items dated from 1759 to 1880, letters written by women of the Saltar and Gordon families. Duke purchased the collection in 2013. At Yale University is the Coleman Brothers collection, 600 items pertaining to two medical doctors who graduated from Yale and practiced in New Jersey. John Saltar, Esquire's daughter, Anne, was married to one of the brothers, Isaac P. Coleman of Pemberton, New Jersey, and there are a number of items in that collection pertaining to Anne and to her family. Yale purchased the collection in 2012. This amount of material on the family, all becoming available in a 5-year period, leads me to believe that it might have come from the descendants of Anne Saltar Coleman's children. They were the logical heirs to this material, and in fact, notes and initials placed on a couple of the items in the 1880s and 1890s indicate that Anne's daughter, Annie Saltar Coleman, had examined the material. The principal figures associated with this collection were members of the interrelated Gordon, Saltar, Wharton, and Wharton-Bickley families, many of whom lived at one time or another on the Magnolia Grove estate, and to a lesser extent, their Howe and Lardner relatives, whose country seats bordered Magnolia Grove. The Howes, in what is now Wissinoming, shown on the left here in 1776, and the Lardners at Somerset, on the river just south of today's Robbins Avenue. Now for some historical perspective on the land on which Magnolia Grove sat and the surrounding area. The name Tacony derives from Lenape words for woods and wilderness, denoting an uninhabited place. For 2 centuries after the arrival of Europeans in the Delaware Valley, variations and combinations of these 4 words were applied to areas with and without specific boundaries along the west side of the Delaware River. In 1675, a surveyor working for the English governor referred to the land that is today's Tacony as being between the land called Pimapacka and the land of Tawakawoni, or between the Pennypack and Wissinoming Creeks. 12 years later, on Thomas Holmes' 1687 map, seen here, that land remained unnamed, and the land south of it, south of Wissinoming Creek, is called Towaconing Township, which is today's Frankfort, Whitehall, and Wissinoming neighborhoods. Modern Tacony, Devereux Street to Totman Avenue, the river to Frankfort Avenue, is owned here by 5 landholders. The lands of Harmon Enoch and Matthias Keene are bookends to land owned by George Hutchinson and Christian Clausen. So it would appear from early maps and other evidence that the use of the name Tacony slowly crept north of Wissinoming Creek into this nameless area. Some examples being, on this 1808 map, Lardner's Somerset estate is named Tacony. And we learn from items in the collection that Lloyd Wharton purchased Magnolia Grove acreage in 1839 from John Saltar, Esquire, who was his uncle, and named his new home Camp Cove, Tacony, as we see on this 1849 map. In November 1847, the Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad named their new facility at the foot of modern Distance Street Tacony Depot, and the community that grew around the depot has been known since as Tacony. However, 14 items in this collection give evidence that this nameless area was known as Tacony more than a century earlier. The earliest item in the collection is this exemplification of a deed from January 13, 1723, which identifies the seller of the land, Gabriel Wilkinson, as being of Tacony. Wilkinson owned the former Clausen property stretching from today's McGee Avenue north to Princeton Avenue. This copy of the deed would have been made sometime after September 1752, as evidenced by the slashed dates at the bottom, which, to make a long story short, reflects an adjustment from the Julian to the Gregorian calendars. The deed transfers 51 acres from Gabriel Wilkinson to Aaron Goforth along the river from today's North Street north to Princeton Avenue. The riverfront portion of that land would later become the site of the Philadelphia and Trenton's Tacony Depot, seen here in an 1851 engraving. Here, in an August 1811 letter written to a cousin from Magnolia Grove, John Saltar, Esquire, uses Tacony in the dateline. And this February 1824 envelope is addressed to Esquire at Tacony. I'll explain as we go on why I keep using the Esquire designation to identify this particular John Saltar. On this map of Philadelphia showing land ownership in 1776, Enoch and Keene's former southern parcel of land is owned by Linford Lardner, and George Hutchinson's former parcel by Thomas Gordon. Gordon's parcel is the Magnolia Grove property, occupying from modern Levick Street to McGee and west from the river almost to the Kings Highway, Frankfort Avenue, along the north side of the old route of Wissinoming Creek, long since covered over and incorporated into the city's sewer system. Thomas Gordon, born in 1712, was a wealthy Philadelphia merchant and former sea captain. He was born in Philadelphia, the son of Alexander Gordon of Edinburgh, Scotland, and Dorothy Hobart, who was a great-aunt of Bishop John Hobart, an important figure in the early history of the Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. In 1730, Thomas married Mary Stapleford, and they had 6 children, 4 living to adulthood: Mary, Alexander, Dorothy, and James. In 1769, daughter Dorothy married John Esquire's older brother, Lawrence Saltar. This is Dorothy's brother, James Wharton, born about 1737. He served with a local militia brigade and fell ill with a fever and died following a review of the troops in Philadelphia by General Washington in 1775. This picture is often misidentified online as being of his father, Thomas, but Fanny Saltar's letters in the collection talk about this particular portrait, which hung in her home, Magnolia Cottage, the site of today's Magnolia Cemetery, and she describes it, writing of the letter in his hand and of the ship in the background. Mary Stapleford Gordon died in 1749, and 2 years later, Thomas married Mary Clark Benbridge, widow of James Benbridge and mother of noted portrait artist Henry Benbridge. It was Henry who painted the portrait of his half-brother James, just shown. Some genealogies list Thomas Gordon's children by his first marriage as having died young, then include those same names among the children of Thomas and Mary Clark Benbridge with murky dates of birth, which I found quite confusing at first. But information found in Fanny's letters and in other items in this collection, chief among them Mary Clark Benbridge Gordon's will, helped to clarify who was who. This second marriage produced 6 children. The oldest was Elizabeth, shown here on the right with her sister Rebecca in another of Benbridge's paintings, which also hung at Fanny's Magnolia Cottage. The third eldest Gordon daughter, Anne, married former Magnolia Grove neighbor William McMurtry in 1782. This is his home, the former Emlyn Estate, on the river at today's Unruh Street. Unruh Street would later be built just to the right here. We will talk about William McMurtry and his famous Tacony estate a little later, as there are some surprising revelations in the portions of Fanny's letters which were not published regarding both her family and Tacony history. This portrait of the Gordon family by Benbridge hangs in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts at Wharton Race. In the middle, between Thomas and Mary, are Elizabeth and Frances. Frances would marry Revolutionary War figure Dr. Enoch Edwards. On Mary's lap is their youngest child, George, born in 1764, and on the right is Thomas. Fanny writes in her letters of the remarkable ordeal of Thomas's service in the British Navy during the Revolutionary War, and of his extravagant spending, both of which we will address later. I discovered from information in Fanny's letters that the Mrs. E.B. Hoskins, who contributed some of the information from Fanny's letters for publication in 1916, was Emily Bullard Hoskins, Thomas's great-granddaughter. This Henry Benbridge portrait hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art and features himself on the left. His half-sister, Frances Gordon, is on the right, and her husband, Revolutionary War figure Dr. Enoch Edwards, is in the middle. Dr. Edwards' niece stands behind him. Henry Benbridge studied with well-known artists in Italy and London and under John Wollaston in Philadelphia, and his works hang in several American galleries. Deed records from January 1750 show that the 151-acre property that would become Magnolia Grove was sold by one Nathaniel Johnson to Admiral Sir Peter Warren, Knight of the Bath, a distinguished British Navy commander who was heavily invested in real estate. There is no reason to believe that Warren ever lived on the property, and in fact he died in Ireland 18 months after the purchase. Items in the collection indicate that Warren's heirs defaulted on the mortgage by 1759 and that Thomas Gordon purchased the property at sheriff's sale for 443 British pounds. Fanny Saltar's writings and a letter written by Henry Benbridge in the Winterthur Library in Delaware indicate that sometime between May 1764 and June 1767, Thomas Gordon and his large family moved 7 miles upriver to their country estate. Magnolia Grove was a substantial building, as we see here in the 1927 photo shortly before it was razed. It was home to large families and household staff during its almost eight decades of ownership by the Gordons and Saltars. Fanny writes that there were 13 in the parlor, including the Gordon children's governess, right after the move. The house sat immediately north of today's Levick Street and is seen just above the old ferry dock in this photo. Thomas Gordon died in 1772, and 2 years later, in 1774, a man we will call John Saltar I married Thomas's oldest daughter, Elizabeth, at Magnolia Grove. There were 4 John Saltars in direct line, so for ease of understanding, they have been given different titles. John Saltar I, who married Elizabeth Gordon, John Saltar, Esquire, their son, whose papers make up the bulk of this collection, Captain John Saltar, who was Esquire's son, and his son, John Jr. We will get to the Captain and Jr. a little down the road. The Saltar family, spelled with an E, can be traced to 1400s England. About 1653, Henry and Hannah Saltar came from England to Charlestown, Massachusetts. One of their children, Richard, arrived in Monmouth County, New Jersey about 1687 and began buying land with money inherited from his mother. From documents related to the land sales, it appears Richard arbitrarily changed the spelling of the name to Saltar with an A upon his arrival there. Richard became a member of the New Jersey Assembly and had a son, also named Richard, who became an active political figure and a judge. It is his son, John, born in 1733, who is John I of our presentation. This is his signature from one of the documents in the collection. At the time of John I's marriage to Elizabeth Gordon in 1774, he was a wealthy lumber merchant in Philadelphia and lived near 2nd and Walnut Streets. His first wife had died, leaving a daughter, Martha, who was raised by a nanny. Shortly after the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, John, Elizabeth, their new daughter Maria, and Margaret, aged 13 by then, moved into Magnolia Grove. Elizabeth's mother, Mary Clark Benbridge Wharton, died 5 years later in 1779. Her will, dated October 10, 1777, and a later letter of administration seen here are in the collection. Part of Mary's will reads, "And I will that monies I have paid for my son Thomas's extravagances," this was the big spending sailor, "be deducted out of his part and be equally divided between my 3 above-mentioned daughters and son George." In November of 1780, while the Revolutionary War was ongoing, John I purchased Magnolia Grove from the heirs of Thomas Wharton for 10,005 continental pounds. There are 2 items in the collection related to that sale. First, in February 1780, John asked attorney Jacob Rush how his mother-in-law's estate would be disposed of. Mr. Rush examined Mrs. Wharton's papers and wrote a 4-page opinion. This is also one of 2 items attesting that slaves worked the Magnolia Grove plantation, as it reads, in part, "I am therefore of opinion, both from the nature of the estate and the words of the will, that Mrs. Wharton could not dispose of by will or otherwise the stock or negroes." And in one of her letters, Fanny writes of hired English and bought Africans, and later bought servants, either Dutch redemptionists or Africans, working as domestics at Magnolia Grove when she was a little girl in the late 1790s. The redemptioners were indentured servants who would earn their freedom over time. Not so, of course, with the Africans. Pennsylvania passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery in 1780, the same year as Attorney Rush wrote this opinion, the first such law in the new country. No slaves appear in Pennsylvania records after 1847, and there is no mention of slaves elsewhere in the collection. In fact, 9 of Fanny's business entries and 3 of the collection's items, dated from 1837 to 1840, concern one Cuffer Todd, a well-off free black man from a community near today's Home Circle, who is written of in Joseph Martindale's 1867 book on the history of Byberry and Moreland Townships. These are 2 of the entries. The 2nd and 6th entries here, payments to Cuffer for work on the farm. These receipts detail John's payments for Magnolia Grove, 2,505 pounds in November 1780 and 7,500 pounds in December of that year. In 1789, at Magnolia Grove, John I's daughter, Margaret, married a neighbor, Revolutionary War veteran John Lardner of Somerset. John had crossed the Delaware with George Washington and had fought at the battles of Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, and Germantown. John and Margaret had 11 children, one of whom is seen here, James, a Naval Academy graduate who went on to a distinguished career and attained the rank of Rear Admiral, a 2-star rank. 2 U.S. Navy ships were named in his honor. He is mentioned in 2 letters in the collection, one of which is from Esquire's daughter, Anne, in 1841, which informs that James and his wife were living at Fanny's Magnolia Cottage. She writes, "Aunt Fanny has her house full. James Lardner with his wife and child and nurse. He keeps a horse there." James might have been assigned at that time to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which was then located at the foot of Federal Street. Another of John and Margaret's children was Henry, who moved to Niles, Michigan. Henry's grandson was famous sports writer and author Ring Lardner, making Ring the great-grandson of John Saltar I. John I and Elizabeth Wharton had 6 children. Numerous items relating to 4 of them, Esquire, Maria, Lucy, and Fanny, are found throughout the collection. Another son, Lawrence, died at St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, in 1802. Like his father before him and his brother, Esquire, he sailed the seas between the Caribbean and Philadelphia, buying, selling, and transporting goods. In the collection, there are 5 letters from Lawrence while he was off on this business, addressed to his father at Magnolia Grove. They are dated between February and August 1802. One of them, seen here, opens as though Lawrence has had a premonition. Dear Father, as I am now about leaving you, my friends, and my country, all perhaps forever, I cannot do it with peace of mind and satisfaction to myself without disclosing to you the cause of my greatest regret. He then goes on to redo his will, giving his share of his father's estate to his sisters, Lucy and Fanny, adding, in case I should be lost at sea, or any other unfortunate circumstance prevent my return. This letter, dated September 8, 1802, arrived from St. Thomas, informing the family that Lawrence had died of fever on August 22nd. It gives an accounting of his belongings and to which family acquaintances in St. Thomas they were turned over. In 1795, at Magnolia Grove, 18-year-old Maria, the oldest child of John I and Elizabeth, married Carney Wharton, a lawyer and shipping merchant who would become president of Philadelphia's Common Council. They had 6 children. Carney was the son of this man, Thomas Wharton, president of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, an office that would evolve into that of governor. Carney's first name, that of his maternal grandmother's family, is invariably found in old publications spelled with an N-E-Y ending. But items in the collection, including his signatures, one of which is seen here, spell it without the E. Interestingly, it is spelled properly on his barely readable headstone at Trinity Oxford Graveyard, but incorrectly on the headstone of his wife, Maria. It is also revealed through several items in the collection that Carney had major financial difficulties spanning decades, right up until his death in 1848, leaving Maria destitute. They relied on the earnings of their son, Lloyd, an attorney, and lived with their daughter's family because they could not afford a home of their own. Here, Carney issues a 60-day promissory note to John Esquire for $1,000 in August 1818. When the time was up, Carney defaulted on the note. From items in the collection, it appears the money was finally paid back years later with huge interest through a complicated process involving Esquire's attorney buying the debt and the involvement of other family members. Here, Lucy Saltar, in her 1825 will, writes, "My sister Maria Wharton's husband's affairs are in a deranged state," and she arranges for money she bequeathed to Maria to be kept out of Carney's hands. In 1831, Maria wrote to Esquire, "I don't know anyone poorer than myself for money. I have none, and the idea of entire dependence is very depressing." After Carney's death in 1848, Maria went to live with her son, Thomas, in a house that sat on what is today the 6500 block of Tulip Street. I'll talk about that house in a bit. She died there in 1867 at the age of 90. Including her childhood, Maria had lived for 37 years on the Magnolia Grove property. After the death of John I in 1811, Magnolia Grove and his other sources of income were owned in common by his children. John Esquire took over the property and operated it as a gentleman farmer, as had his father. Numerous items pertaining to this business are in the collection, including many pages in a large ledger which actually begins in June 1801 and shows John I as an investor in a brigantine named Rosetta, which had a lucrative merchant voyage to Spain and was involved in the salvage of 1,200 gallons of rum from a sloop which had run aground in Maryland. Land sales and sales of wood from the Magnolia property were split equally by the heirs, and many items in the collection discuss the terms of the splits. Nephew Lloyd Wharton, an attorney, seems to have handled the legal end of the family's business affairs. Between about 10 sets of pages in the ledger were at one time, apparently, pressed several leaves of an American sweet gum tree, leaving distinct impressions. In one of her unpublished letters, Fanny, writing of her childhood at Magnolia Grove, tells her grandniece, "Sometimes I sought the green meadow to gather strawberries, magnolias, sweet williams, and numberless other wildflowers which grew in great profusion round the old gum tree, which supplied us with the mistletoe bough for our Christmas sports. Perhaps these leaves were from that tree." In 1828, 43 acres of Magnolia Grove land adjoining Esquire's mansion were sold by the family to West Point graduate and War of 1812 veteran Captain Thomas Baird, who sold the land in 1837 to a Benjamin Davids. The same year, David sold the land to Caspar Wister Morris. The deeds show that there was a mansion house on that acreage right behind the Magnolia Grove mansion as early as January 1828. It is seen as Morris's house on this 1843 map. What year it was built or by whom I was unable to determine. And Magnolia Grove is shown here as Magnolia Hill, a name not found in the collection. Between 1831 and 1843, 3 additional family homes were built on the estate. Fanny acquired 43 acres on the western end of the property and built Magnolia Cottage, seen here at the top. The scallop cut indenture for that property is in the collection and is seen here, dated May 13, 1831. Today, Magnolia Cemetery sits on 9 acres of that land. On a portion of that acreage, Fanny's house had sat, and both the cemetery and nearby Cottage Street were named for Fanny's house. In March 1839, John Esquire advertised Magnolia Grove for sale. 1 month later, he sold the property to his nephew, Lloyd Wharton. Lloyd built his home, called Camp Cove Tacony, on the south side of today's McGee Avenue, then called Saltar's Lane, just east of State Road, near that clump of trees in the middle here. In July 1843, Lloyd sold 20 acres of that land to his brother Thomas, a banker, who built a large house on what is today the east side of the 6500 block of Tulloch Street. The house would become very well known during the last 3 decades of the century as the residence of its next owner, M. Louise Thomas, a remarkable feminist, author, and business leader. Mrs. Thomas and the house are written of extensively in my book on William H. Gatzmer and the railroad. You'll notice that the name associated with Camp Cove Tacony here is L.W. Bickley. The L.W. is for Lloyd Wharton. Isaac Bickley, first cousin to Lloyd Wharton's great-grandmother, Mary Clark Benbridge Wharton, owned the 250-acre Penn Ryn estate on the river in Bensalem, 5 miles north of Magnolia Grove. Isaac had no children, nor did any of his 7 siblings, and wished the Bickley name to be carried on. And so, in 1842, he offered that if Lloyd would add Bickley to his name, Isaac would bequeath him Penn Ryn upon the death of the last Bickley. Lloyd was chosen over his older brother Thomas because Lloyd had 4 sons who could carry the name. Thomas had 2 daughters. Lloyd made the name change legal in January 1843 and inherited Penn Ryn when the last of Isaac's siblings died. That was Elizabeth Bickley, who lived the last 4 years of her life at Camp Cove Tacony and died there in 1854 at the age of 93. Ironically, Thomas Lloyd's daughter, Lucy, born in 1841, who was raised in Tacony and married into the Drexel family, purchased Penn Ryn in 1890 from the widow of Lloyd's son, Lloyd Wharton Bickley II, seen here. Penn Ryn was in Lucy's family until 1945. Lucy's mother was Sarah Ann Smith, known as Sally. Her mother was a Hale, a sister of Esquire's wife. A silhouette of Sally is in the collection and is shown here. Although these are the papers of John Esquire, it is his sister Fanny, 8 years his junior, who is the star of the show. There are numerous items in the collection pertaining to Fanny, and she is, of course, the most widely known of the siblings by virtue of the letters published in 1916. Shown here are the letters from which some of the published information originated. I say some of because the written letters in the collection leave us with a mystery. Total, there are 10 letters in the collection written by Fanny, 37 pages in all, and she generally covers every square inch of the paper. She's very chatty, and she's a most helpful informant when it comes to family information and understanding who's who in her extended family. And here is the mystery. You might be aware that the community of Frankfurt claims what is called the first 4th of July, based on a claim that the signers of the Declaration of Independence, after the signing, spent the afternoon at Henry Drinker's estate, near the intersection of today's Frankfurt and Kensington Avenue. In 1792, Drinker sold the property to Fanny Saltar's uncle, Dr. Enoch Edwards. There was an octagon-shaped summer house on that property. In the published version of Fanny's letters, she writes, "One day when Mr. Jefferson was on a visit to my uncle, they walked up to this summer house. He looked round and said, 'This is the spot on which the signers of the Declaration of Independence dined the day they signed the Declaration.'" Now this bolstered the first claim about this event, which had been made 44 years earlier, in 1872, by one Thomas Murphy in a Frankfurt church publication. Absent any sources, Mr. Murphy stated that tradition stated that the signers had spent the afternoon of July 4th, 1776 at the summer house. The problem here is that Fanny, in writing about this summer house in the collection's written letters about visiting her aunt and uncle Edwards, of whom she was very fond, and of having played in and about the summer house as a child, never once mentions Thomas Jefferson or a conversation he had with her uncle. In fact, where Fanny's written letter ends, shown here with the words, "This lady afterwards married Mr. Mount," the published version continues, telling of the conversation and of other information and of another curious entry involving Dr. Edwards. That is, that he dressed General Lafayette's wound at the Battle of Brandywine. According to another article published by Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1885, that wound was dressed by a Dr. McGaw of Franklin County, Pennsylvania, with no mention of Enoch Edwards. Joe Menkovich, a Philadelphia historical researcher, without knowing Fanny's written letters omitted the conversation. This wasn't known until I examined the letters last year. As a website, where using other evidence, he makes a convincing argument against the Jefferson-Edwards conversation ever having taken place. Fanny's written letters do nothing to contradict Joe's findings. Was information added to the published version by Fanny's grandniece, or was there at one time another letter among these papers that contained that conversation? We'll likely never know. I submitted a research request to Historical Society of Pennsylvania relative to any material they might still have from E.B. Hoskins' contribution in 1916, but without result. The published versions of Fanny's letters were portions taken from 4 of the written letters in the collection addressed to her grandniece, Maria Morris. There is a 5th letter from which no information was taken and which contains, for those interested in Northeast Philadelphia history, the most interesting information. Researching for the Gatzmer book, I was able to locate 4 Tacony connections to the Revolutionary War. 3 of them concerned the service of local landowners in the Continental Army. The 4th of George Castor, who, while plowing a field near today's Frankfurt Avenue and McGee, had a team of horses and other stock taken from him by British soldiers in the spring of 1778. Fanny, in this 5th letter, gives us valuable additional information previously unknown on events that took place right along the river in Tacony. As I've mentioned, a segment from one of Fanny's letters appearing in the published version tells of the adventures of her mother's brother Thomas Wharton, the extravagant spender, who as a British naval officer was with the detachment that burned Bordentown, New Jersey, and who was later captured by the Colonials, escaped, and made his way back to Magnolia Grove half dead. His property was confiscated after the war, but returned when he was able to prove that his mother had placed him in the British Navy at a young age. Perhaps E.B. Hoskins, a direct descendant of Thomas, thought that that was enough talk of the family's connection to Britain during the war, and that might have precluded the information in the 5th letter from seeing publication, as Fanny reveals there that her father's brother, Joseph Saltar, was jailed for being a British sympathizer, and that her mother's sister, Anne Wharton, had married one, William McMurtry. Fanny writes that Magnolia Grove was very frequently disturbed, in her words, by both sides during the war, 2 or 3 times by the British during their occupation of Philadelphia, from September 1777 until June of 78. Colonial troops raided Magnolia Grove once during the war, resulting in the death of a beloved family horse. Fanny further relates that British troops raided the home of Brian Wilkinson, taking all of his wagons, horses, cows, pigs, poultry, grain, hay, and produce. A clean sweep, she writes. That home is seen here and sat on the river between modern Noor and Longshore Streets. It was later the Buttermilk Tavern, a popular vacation hotel from the 1830s until purchased by Diston Sawworks for office space in the 1870s. It was torn down for factory expansion in 1883. This photo is from 1870. Emlenton, the estate of British sympathizer and later Gordon in-law William McMurtry, was raided frequently by colonial troops, writes Fanny, taking whatever they wanted. The Pennsylvania government charged McMurtry with treason in 1778, but the case was discharged the following year. Later owned by the Green family and renamed Silver Pine, the house was purchased by Distons and razed in 1882. Several items in the collection are related to a family servant written of at length by Fanny and appearing in the reminiscences. This was the beloved Molly. From several items in the collection, including an indenture, a deed poll, and her will, I was able to piece together that Molly's right name was Mary Snook, and that her parents lived next door to the Benbridge family in the 500 block of Walnut Street as early as 1742. She appears to have become an indentured servant to Mary Clark Benbridge sometime before Mary's 1751 marriage to Thomas Gordon, and elected to remain with the family after becoming free, staying with them until her death in 1816, a total of more than 65 years' service. In her will, Molly bequeathed the Walnut Street home, which she had inherited, to Fanny's mother, Elizabeth Gordon Saltar, who she described as my best friend through life. And now to John Esquire. As a young man, to which several letters in the collection attest, John was a seafaring merchant, investing in goods to take abroad and in goods abroad to bring back to America. He might have engaged in this occupation for up to 11 years. He spent a year in Calcutta, India, and he writes about his adventures and investments in several letters to his parents at Magnolia Grove. In January 1811, Esquire married neighbor Margaret Howe, daughter of this man, Samuel Howe, and his wife, Margaret Emlyn, who was the daughter of George Emlyn III, who had built Emlenton in 1760. Margaret was born in 1784, the 10th of 15 children. There are a number of items in the collection pertaining to her siblings, their spouses, and their children, and from them I was able to put together a pretty good look at who was who in the Howe family. Numerous bills, receipts, and the ledger give a good look at the merchants Esquire dealt with in his operation of Magnolia Grove Farm. The bulk of them are from the nearby communities of Frankfort and Holmesburg. Others are neighbors in Tacony. The names read like a street guide for lower northeast Philadelphia. Among them Buckius, Castor, Conley, Crispin, Folkrod, Gillingham, Pratt, Rohrer, Shallcross, and Scattergood. As I've mentioned, Esquire sold his portion of Magnolia Grove to his nephew, Lloyd Wharton, later Bickley, in 1839. John, Margaret, and their daughter Anne then went to live with Fanny at Magnolia Cottage. Anne, 23 by this time, was already spending much of her time in Pemberton, New Jersey, with a number of her Howe cousins who owned property there. Both the Howe and Saltar families were involved with the historic early iron furnaces near Pemberton, the Saltars at Addison and the Howes at Hanover. Anne would marry Dr. Isaac Pearson Coleman of Pemberton, and Esquire and Margaret would move to a house on Dr. Coleman's 100-acre farm about 1842, shown in the center of the map here. That same year, according to items in the collection, Esquire and Margaret traveled to Rockford, Illinois, where their son, Captain John, was living. Captain John's wife had just died, and Esquire and Margaret brought back to Pemberton John Jr., Captain John's son, age 9, in order to raise him there. This is the grave of Captain John in Steilacoom, Washington. He was a colorful, larger-than-life character. He was born in 1814 and raised at Magnolia Grove. He left to seek his fortune out west at age 21 in 1835. He was part of the mob that chased the Mormons out of Nauvoo, Illinois in 1844, and the Mormons had a price on his head, dead or alive, for a number of years. He later owned a sawmill and a Mississippi steamboat. He crossed the plains to the Pacific coast twice, where he worked in mining. He built a boat in Maine and plied the seas as a merchant, picking up his captain moniker. He eventually ended up in Steilacoom, where he became clerk of the U.S. District Court and collector and assessor of U.S. Internal Revenue for Idaho and Washington. He died in 1899. Steilacoom sits on Puget Sound, a few miles southwest of Tacoma. A popular waterfront park there is Saltar's Point, site of Captain John's former home. Captain John remarried and had a daughter, Margaret, likely named for his mother. Her will, penned when she was 21, is in the collection. It's well written, includes some humor, and a promise to return from the afterlife. I, Margaret Elizabeth Saltar, spinster, being at this moment, as usual, clothed and in my right mind. Now that's what I call a good, strong beginning. She goes on to say that she has nothing of consequence to bequeath, does not want anyone to mourn, or as she writes, don even a black thread for me. Margie is most certain she will manifest herself after death to her friends and to her mother, whom she wishes, she writes, to look on the bright side, not grieve, and keep her mind as calm and cheerful as possible, thereby enabling me to come to her all the more readily, which I will surely do. Margaret died just 34 months later at the age of 24 and is buried with her parents. There are 7 wills in the collection dated from 1779 to 1856. Esquire's, that of his wife Margaret, his brother Lawrence, his sister Lucy, his grandmother, Mary Clark Benbridge Wharton, and of course the beloved Molly. Captain John's son, John Jr., born in 1845, raised at Pemberton, is the only one of the 4 generations of John Salters for whom we have a photo. He joined the Army at age 18 at the height of the Civil War, and later attended Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and went on to a remarkable career as an engineer. One of his many achievements was the development of the gas engine that powered the first successful class of submarines, the Holland class. He married Sally Coleman of Pemberton, daughter of Dr. J.P. Coleman, brother of Isaac Coleman, who was married to Annie Saltar. Jr. died in 1906. One of the more interesting letters in the collection is this flim-flam attempt, postmarked March 25, 1843, from Wisconsin Territory, 5 years before it became a state. Addressed to Esquire, it purported to be from his son Lawrence, who had died more than 10 years earlier in Cincinnati. The writer states that the letter informing of his death had been a forgery, and that he'd actually been imprisoned, the result of his having been duped into possession of counterfeit currency. After his release, his shame prevented him from facing his family again, but now, all these long years later, sick and impoverished, he'd like to receive some funds with which he'd return home. Please direct your letter to Edward Jones, he writes, because I am not known here by my own name. The writer must have known a little something about the family, as he inquires about the willow and cedar trees Lawrence had planted at Magnolia Grove, and makes a reference to Aunt Fanny. But he misspells the surname of his half cousins. He misspells Lloyd Wharton's first name. He refers to his sister as Anna instead of Ann, and as you can see here, he spells Lawrence with an A instead of an E. This is a receipt for Esquire's pew rent at Trinity Oxford Church from 1835. It is signed by William Overington, a vestryman at the church for 70 years and its treasurer for 63. Mr. Overington is buried at Oxford Church, about 10 yards from Esquire. There are numerous tax bills in the collection from the city for the Walnut Street house and from Oxford Township for Magnolia. This is a December 1834 real estate tax bill for Magnolia Grove and for Fanny's Magnolia Cottage. Total tax $29.62. John is also taxed 50 cents on his dog. Patterson Hartshorn was a cousin of the Saltars. There are 3 items related to him in the collection, all of them fines for missing meetings. This one, dated October 3rd, 1796, assesses him a fine of 1 shilling 6 pence for missing a meeting of the Fellowship Fire Company. Fellowship was the second fire company in Philadelphia, organized in 1736, the same year as the first, Benjamin Franklin's Union Fire Company. In 1852, city surveyor Samuel H. Knies, whose signature is shown here, made a draft of a 3,400 square foot property Esquire owned on Delaware Avenue. John's last name is misspelled here. 19 years earlier, in 1833, Mr. Knies had surveyed the line of the newly formed Philadelphia and Trenton Railroad. The rails ran through the Magnolia Grove property just 500 yards from the mansion. The line is still there today, part of Amtrak's Northeast Corridor. There are some surprisingly crisp seals on some of the documents in the collection, like this one from May 1840 from the Registrar's Office of the City and County of Philadelphia. Esquire's wife Margaret died on December 28, 1856. This letter from nephew Thomas Lloyd Wharton expresses his condolences. The last item in the collection date-wise is this power of attorney given by Esquire to the husband of a niece on September 17, 1858. Esquire was 77 years of age here, and his signature is large and uneven, quite a contrast from the signature on the bottom from 2 decades earlier. 53 days later, on November 9, 1858, John Saltar Esquire passed away. Fanny, born in 1790, never married and lived to be 90 years old. The youngest child of John I and Elizabeth Wharton, she outlived all 6 of her children. Interestingly, the aunt for whom she was named, Frances Gordon Edwards, had also lived to be 90. Fanny's brother, George Gordon Saltar, 3 years younger than Fanny and the closest to her in age, died at age 21 in 1809. A silhouette of George is in the collection, along with a remembrance of him written by his sister Lucy. A week after the burial of Maria Wharton, the last of Fanny's siblings, in July 1867, also at age 90, Fanny, then age 77, wrote another letter, this one to no one in particular. It is among her papers in the collection. It describes her happy and contented life living with the family of Esquire's daughter in Pemberton. A sad portion of it addresses Maria's funeral. Last Thursday, I saw my dear sister Marie Wharton lying in her softly lined coffin, looking calmly happy. Her children, grandchildren, relatives, and friends stood around her final bed in Oxford Churchyard, where she lay resting, where lay resting her father, mother, brothers, sister, husband, children, and dear relatives, and I too hope to find a resting place close beside my fond sister Lucy and between the tombs of my father and mother and my brothers Lawrence and George. This, my friends have promised, will be done. And that promise was fulfilled, as Fanny too lies at Trinity, Oxford, right behind Lucy, whose headstone is seen here. And with 3 generations of her family, 13 members in all, buried in a row. Between Gordons, Saltars, Whartons, and Wharton-Bickleys, 4 generations of the family lived on the Magnolia Grove property for over a century. Caspar Wister Morris, who bought the land Fanny had sold to Captain Baird in 1825, eventually acquired Esquire's Magnolia Grove acreage. And by the 1850s, as Tacony became a popular day's outing and vacation destination featuring the Buttermilk Tavern and the recreation grounds of the railroad's Washington House Hotel, Morris turned the riverfront portion of the property into Creedmoor Park and Magnolia Grove into a hotel and restaurant. Serviced by steamboats and featuring a playing field for the new game of baseball, Creedmoor Park for many summers hosted throngs of people escaping the heat of the crowded city. It operated under that name and as Glendale Grove into the 1890s. Time marches on, but this primary source material is a rare find and has given us an opportunity to look back at a place long vanished and to get a glimpse into the lives of the people who lived here. I hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I enjoyed giving it. Thank you all very much. I'll take any questions. I must have covered all bases.